So for my first question, what country did your parents come from?
My mother came from Czechoslovakia and my father came from Hungary.
My mother comes from the Ukraine. My father comes from Lithuania.
When did they come to America and why?
My mother was one of 10, and in the 20s, the family made the decision to come to America for a better way of life. So the two oldest children, who were daughters, and their husbands emigrated to America, and one by one they brought all the other siblings and the parents. So by the late 1930s, everybody was in the country.
My mother came in 1918 when she was 12 years old. She came because at that time we were Jewish, and the Cossacks were coming through our town. It was a small town, and actually killing the Jews. So all the Jews that could come to America did.
My father actually came here in 1939, and he came here because of the deteriorating situation for Jews in Europe. Hitler was just making his moves, and he might have already invaded Poland, and was already putting in place some of his anti-Semitic policies. So my father, his brother, and his brother's wife, and my grandmother all decided to come to America.
I came from Lithuania. I really know nothing. My father died when I was very, very young.
What did your parents do for work?
In Europe, in Budapest, my father had worked for an antique dealer and used to travel around buying antiques for the owner of the shop. When he came here, he didn't speak the language. It was very difficult to find work at first. But at that time, it seemed like Jewish immigrants found a niche in the fur industry, and they used to cut the fur, put it together. There was an influx of Jewish immigrants working in the fur industry, and that's what he ended up doing. He had two brother-in-laws who were already doing that, and they were able to get him a job.
My mother, she became what they call a machine operator of women's clothing, where she would sew to. She was what they call a piece goods worker. She'd get paid by the piece, and she would sew clothing together.
So my mother, at least while I was growing up, basically didn't work. She did try and work in the fur industry, but unfortunately for her, she was allergic to the fur hair. And she used to get really bad coughs from it. When I was probably in high school, older, she did some part-time work at a textile store in the neighborhood.
What was it like for your parents to adjust to living in America?
I think the language was the biggest issue, in finding the ability to communicate with people who do not speak their language. So that was a big learning curve. It was a learning curve also in terms of getting a job for my father. They really were uncomfortable leaving their little enclave of Borough Park, where they had family, friends, and people who spoke the same language. They also spoke Yiddish, so that was a very common language for people from different parts of Eastern Europe to speak to each other.
I'm sure it was very hard. She didn't speak the language. She spoke Russian and she spoke Yiddish, which is a form of a Jewish language from Eastern Europe. And she went to night school as a young girl to learn English.
Did your parents' experiences as immigrants influence the way they raised you and your siblings?
I think it did. I think, first of all, there was always some fear of authority. There was always a fear that what happened in Europe could happen in America. And I think my attitude growing up was, this will never happen in America. America is a totally different country than Europe. that even having to, I remember we once had a robbery of clothing from our clothing line, and they had to call the police, and they were so fearful of speaking to the police and making sure they gave them the exact items that were stolen, and I sort of couldn't relate to that because I grew up in never thinking about the issues that they and the fears they had growing up living in Europe.
Of course, they spoke Yiddish in the house, English sometimes. But I'll tell you one thing about my mother. She always stressed education. Education was like the most important part of our lives, to educate me, actually. And even though she worked in the shop all day long, when she came home, she always went over my math with me, my schoolwork. She always wanted to know exactly what I did in school.
Okay, thank you for your time.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure.